Good morning. It is Wednesday, February 5th, 2025. This is the RED-C Roundup. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Deacon Mike Beauvais. Today, as always, we have a great show in store for you. We have Mr. Charles Fraune, and I had to make sure to get that name correct, who is going to be doing a Lenten mission here at St. Anthony's in Bryan. And he is the author of a number of books. Come Away by Yourselves, A Guide to Prayer for Busy Catholics, Swords and Shadows, Navigating Youth Amidst the Wiles of Satan, and the international best-selling spiritual warfare book, Slaying Dragons, What Exorcists See and What We Should Know. He works full-time now in his Slaying Dragons apostolate, and I'm pretty sure that keeps him busy. Good morning, Charles. How are you?
Good morning, Deacon. Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks again for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. And this is a topic that I don't think as Catholics we talk about enough because we are so afraid of scaring people.
Mm-hmm.
But I think just being aware of this is important for us as Catholics, because I think one of the great deficits in our culture is a belief that the devil doesn't exist and therefore there's nothing out there to be scared of. And if devil doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist. So it's important for us to recognize that if we believe God exists, then we believe the devil exists, and that has implications on how we live our life.
Yeah, and the idea of salvation implies we're being saved from something. So we have to understand what that is.
Yes. Now, I always start out the interviews asking a little bit about your faith background. Are you a cradle Catholic?
Yeah, so I was born in the church and baptized and raised in a Catholic family, going to Mass regularly. But I would say it was a nominal Catholic home, which was typical. Nothing against my parents. My mom was actually Protestant. She was a Presbyterian. She converted when I was in high school, thanks be to God. But growing up, it was, we struggled to be a devout family. I think, with my dad working a lot because he has to, I feel that pressure now. I have 4 kids of my own. So a nominal Catholic home as a result. So I didn't really learn how to pray, didn't pick up the rosary, didn't understand scripture, didn't know a lot of theology. When I had my conversion, when I came back to the church when I was 20, I always called it a conversion because it was so powerful. I was learning things that were fundamental. I didn't know anything about the Eucharist. I didn't understand mortal sin. So my catechesis as a youth was just bad. But that was the lot for a lot of us, unfortunately. So my upbringing was in the church, but not completely.
Now, you said it has happened when you were 20. Did you notice a drift away from the church in high school? Was it noticeable, or was it just still maintaining this sort of modest Catholicism?
Yeah, it was pretty evident. So I didn't like going to Mass. As my brother said, so my brother and I both left the church when we graduated from high school, but he never came back. I did, but I did only because God intervened in a very powerful way. Otherwise, I would have kept going and never would have come back. But prior to that, as my brother has pointed out, since my conversion, because I wanted to be a priest too, this is 25 years ago when I had my big conversion. So since that time, I processed a lot of things about my faith. My brother always pointed out, you hated going to Mass as a kid, even more than he did. I just did not, I would pretend to be asleep every Sunday morning and hope my dad would just give up. And sometimes he did, just because I guess I was really stubborn, and how much you can fight a kid who doesn't want to go. So I didn't really have a faith. I had a very minimal concept of God's existence. But my life, from the age of 5, I was teased constantly until mid-high school. So that really formed me, that kind of bullying, being outcast and stuff. We can talk about that later. That had a big impact on my whole life, as you can imagine. My faith life was pretty much nothing. So when I graduated from high school, I left and didn't miss anything. There was nothing I didn't feel like I was leaving. I didn't make a decision to stop being Catholic. I just continued on my natural course, and now I'm outside of the house, so no one's pressuring me to go to Mass, and I'm not going to. So my departure was complete when I left the home after high school, but it was brewing all along.
So what was the impetus for the conversion? What happened that initiated this?
Yeah, and this is where I could, if I had the time, I could easily write a book on that, because like I said, it starts when I was 5. When it all goes back, it's tied into the bullying. So long story short, because we could do like 2 hours on this. Um, when I so my conversion pivoted around a really dark depression. And this depression was tied, it was a major depression. I was seeing a therapist at this point, so she diagnosed me with acute anxiety disorder, um, social anxiety disorder, and major depression, which eventually manifested in panic attacks about 6 months after this. So this was my second year of college when I was like 19. So I dropped out of college at that point, and I stayed at college. I should have gone home, but I didn't know. No one really pressed me. I wanted the freedom, but I should have gone home, because it was literally, I cried myself to sleep. It was that bad, that dark, that depressing for like 3 months. Cried myself to sleep. It was in the middle of that our Lord essentially appeared, not in a vision, but in an inclination that I suddenly had towards being religious, which was alien to me. And it was deep, and it gave me a little bit of hope. And then when I went home for Christmas, and the inspiration was, I want to wear a cross. Like I was dabbling, not really dabbling, but in Buddhism. Like I was like all over the place. I didn't know what I believed. Nothing was helping me. So I was really depressed. I saw no hope. But then all of a sudden, the inspiration was, it was October near my birthday, was I want to wear a small wooden cross. And I want the cross to be relatively worthless. Like, no one's going to steal it. It's going to be on a piece of yarn, no chain. I don't want anything flashy. Just want a cross. But I don't know why. I don't know why I wanted that cross. Because every night I was crying myself to sleep. And the cry was, God, why are you letting this happen? And why are you doing this to me? And why won't you make it stop? So I didn't really trust God at that point, but I guess deep down inside, I knew he could do something if he wanted to. So then this cross idea appears in my mind, and I go home for Christmas. I don't tell anybody about it, because why would I? I'm not religious. Why am I going to share this with anybody? I go home at Christmas, and there's this area in the main living room where I put my keys, my wallet, and some stuff. And I came down one morning, because I was staying at home for a week or so, and there was a small wooden cross designed to be worn on a piece of yarn. I'm like, wait a second. Why is this next to all my stuff? And I picked it up, just kind of blown away. Like, went over to my mom, and I couldn't really come up with a question. I couldn't get any words out. I was just so blown away. Like, what is this? Did you read my mind? Who? And then I knew immediately that this was divine providence. I didn't have that term yet. I didn't know that idea yet of divine providence, but this was God doing something. And I know it was him, because my first instinctive reaction was, I need to start going back to Mass. That was me. Like, I had that thought, and I hated Mass. I had never had a love for Mass, never enjoyed Mass ever at this point. But now, because of this cross, I need to go back to Mass, because I knew somehow God had the power to help me in whatever way. I didn't know what that would be like. And I did. I started going back to Mass, and it was awful, because social anxiety, when you're going into a crowd, I mean, it was bad. But that was the beginning of the conversion, and it happened right around, I think that was a Jubilee year, as I remember. The beginning of the year 2000 was when I essentially converted, and yeah, everything, whole new phase in my life started then.
Now, you went ahead and pursued a master's degree in theology. Was this something that developed because of your return to the church and then the newfound interest in your spirituality?
Yeah, so the master's degree was probably about 10 years after that was when I got it. So I was still in college, so I, kind of slow recovery from the depression and anxiety, but got back on my feet. Within about 6 months, 7 months, I started a community college to ease my way back into college. I took a whole year off, finished my undergraduate. I flipped. When I went back to college, took that year off. When I went back to college, I flipped from, what was it, anthropology that I was studying, to religion. And at that secular university, that meant studying Buddhism, Islam, Old Testament, New Testament, evil, atheism. My professors were believers in all of those different religions. It was fascinating. And it really allowed me to work out what I believed by testing all these other religions and talking to these professors, because I was still a baby Catholic, still searching, but also very much believing. I got my undergraduate, and then went into the seminary program with my local diocese. And that was a long, protracted thing. Like, there were a lot of politics. I ended up doing 3 pastoral years, finally got to the seminary because we got a new bishop. So the whole thing, and then I was in seminary for a year and a half. That whole thing was about 9 years. By the end of it, God gave me clarity, finally clarity, that I don't want you to be a priest. I was not expecting that, but I'm like, I now see it clearly. I'm as happy as I could ever be because I finally know what God wants me to do. So I left the seminary as happy as I've ever been. And then I took all of that formation, all those classes and things, and combined it with an half online, half on campus master's program with Christendom College's graduate program. So I got that in 2011. So that was 11 years after my conversion is when I got my master's in theology with an advanced apostolic catechetical diploma, which is great. That's a nice little thing to go with this catechetics focused master's program in theology. And then I started teaching at a Catholic high school right after that. But so it was a long process.
Now, did you start writing before your postgraduate work, or did you start writing because of that?
Well, and this is where I think, again, divine providence. Nothing is wasted. Talents you see as a kid, like he put those there, and often he'll make use of them. So I started writing when I was 12. And as I recall, the inspiration began when I watched Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Movie 3, when they were still good before they kept making movies and they shouldn't have. But they were chasing the Holy Grail, and I'm like, oh, what is this? This is great. This is very mystical. What is this Holy Grail stuff? Like, is it spiritual adventures? And so I started writing my own little Grail diary. I'm not sure if you've ever seen the movie, but I've loved that movie. There are a lot of flaws I see now in it, so I don't completely advise watching it just because of the morality of some of the characters. But otherwise, it was a great adventure. And I started writing, and my love for writing and this seed for spiritual adventure were planted at the same time at the age of 12. And I remember in high school, I wrote a story, pretty elaborate, like, I don't know, kind of solar, not UFOs, but something like that. Really elaborate story, and accidentally threw it away at the end of the school year because I just dumped all of my stuff, and my story went in the trash can with it. But so from the age of 12, I've been writing. And then after my conversion, inspired by Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, I saw those, heard about that for the first time when the movies came out. And I was inspired by that, but I was also Catholic at that point. So I started writing my own spiritual adventure, fantasy adventure like Tolkien, but all this stuff like this. But the real meat of my writing began after my master's. Once I got my master's, I was getting up at like 3:30 every morning and just doing deep dive research on like 6 different topics at the same time. None of those were ever published. So what got me into what I'm doing now was divine providence. Like I did not seek to write the books that have been published. I sought to write other books, which were never published. So that's kind of a neat twist.
Now, before we get into the books, something you said sort of made me think. You were talking about taking the secular version of religious studies and being exposed to all these different religions and all these professors that believe different things. I've always found that, the most vital questions for us as seekers is it true? And was this one of the thoughts that went through your mind, taking this, which one of these is true and how can I know?
Yeah, and I think this was another nice element of divine providence, because I ended up teaching for 10 years at a Catholic high school. High schoolers are very inquisitive, and they want real answers. They want honest answers, no fluff. Like, I know you're trying to pull a fast one on me, Mr. Fraune. So I had my conversion. I was still a weak Catholic when I went back to college, flipped to religion, started studying Islam, Buddhism, Old Testament. I think those were some of the first courses. And I was still curious, still not completely convinced deep down inside, even though I was seeing supernatural effects in my life from Christ's work, because he was saving me from the devastating life that I was living at the moment. But I was not intellectually convinced, like you said. So once my faith did deepen, I was going to daily mass. This was about another 6 months or a year later. I would go from daily mass and then to Tibetan Buddhism. And I was still open. It was still like, okay, Tibetan Buddhists, now's your chance to convince me. Like, are you right, or is Catholicism right? And I was genuinely open. I had already ruled out Protestantism. I'm not really sure exactly why, but that was fast to rule out. I don't know. But Buddhism, for some reason, had this lingering appeal. All the other religions essentially died. Islam had died down, Hinduism, nothing was really arguing with me yet. I had this image of a council in my mind of like all these different representatives of all these different philosophies and religions that were arguing, vying for my attention, my intellectual consent. And the only two that remained were Catholicism and Buddhism, because Buddhism has, meditation, fasting, prayer, whatever they call, their form of prayer. So it was appealing in a certain ways. And the professor was a practicing Tibetan Buddhist. So I would talk to him after class a lot, like, look, explain this to me. I don't understand this. I don't understand this. And he gave me unconvincing answers. There's a kind of mystical assent. You just have to believe it. There isn't a rational component to a lot of what Buddhism teaches. And I'm like, no, that's just not going to work for me. And at the same time, my Catholic faith was growing, and I was seeing rational and supernatural evidence that this is true, and just experiential evidence that this is real, because my life was changing. And then all the competition died eventually. Didn't take very long, and Catholicism was the clear winner. But I kept challenging it. I kept having this intellectual argument with myself, which can be kind of destructive, or not destructive, but an obstacle. If you doubt too much, eventually, like the Apostle Thomas, it can get in your way. But I think it worked because of what field I went into. All this questioning is valuable when your faith becomes, so strong later.
And I think this is one of the things for me growing up. One of the things that caused my drifting away from the church for a while was this catechesis of you just have to believe.
Mm.
And it wasn't until I was exposed to the reasonable side of Catholicism that I realized that it takes both. Fides et ratio had not been written yet. So
that's right.
And so, for me, it was always, it has to make sense if I'm going to believe it. I mean, I don't have to understand all of it, but it has to make sense. And so I think sometimes we do a disservice to young people because we don't dare go into the intelligibility of Catholicism because we're afraid they might not understand and drift away, rather than allowing them to be challenged and ask the question, well, is this true and how can I prove it?
Yeah, exactly, because they're being bombarded right now with so many ideas and philosophies. So for us to argue that Catholicism is true, like, we have to back it up. We have to give, and thankfully, like, a lot of good apologetics groups are doing that in a heroic way, and like, helping me resolve some of those lingering doubts that were planted as a kid too.
Well, yes, there are so many wonderful resources now that, if nothing else, help us in explaining something that we know to be true, because people have much better answers than I do.
Yeah.
Now,
especially when you bring science in.
Exactly. So I want to pivot to your books.
Mhm.
What was the first book that you wrote that was published, and what was the impetus for it?
Yeah, and I believe, again, divine providence. After my conversion, I did a retreat at a Maronite monastery with a friend of mine for 5 days, a 5 full day silent retreat. And I was still not quite I was, I guess, a toddler Catholic at that point, maybe a middle school, a spiritual age. So I was desiring all this stuff, but a silent retreat is pretty intense. But on the retreat, I found a book by St. Alphonsus Liguori, and that was my first introduction to him, and he is now by far, hands down, my favorite literary saint and saint in general, because I've learned so much more about him since I've been doing this work. So my first book is Come Away by Yourselves, A Guide to Prayer for Busy Catholics. I used to have a different subtitle, but I realized the book really needs A Guide to Prayer for Busy Catholics as the subtitle. So I recently updated that subtitle and changed the cover for anybody who's heard of the book already. But A Guide to Come Away by Yourselves is based on the teachings of St. Alphonsus Liguori in his How to Converse Always and Familiarly with God. That book was that's what I was reading, 2018. And I'm just like, this book is great. So I started telling my wife, like, St. Alphonsus said, blah, 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 blah. And she's like, that sounded good, but you lost me real fast. Like, I don't understand what that means. Can you write a little reflection for me, is what she said, based on that? I'm like, okay. So I wrote 3, showed them to her. She's like, these are great. And then she said, can you write more? I'm like, okay. So I wrote 6 in total. And she showed them to a friend of hers, and they're both like, these are great. So I showed them to a priest friend of mine who was with me in seminary. He actually got ordained. He's like, these are good, but you need more. I had 9 at that point that I'd written, but you need more. You need like a part 1, an introduction to these reflections. You don't want to just publish the reflections. The long story short, I got part 1, part 2, Come Away by Yourselves. I have a priest friend who is the censor for the diocese, and he did a nihil obstat for it. So he examined it, gave me some feedback, and cleaned it up, and he put his stamp on it. So that was the first book, and that kind of woke up the whole writing process. Like, wow, I can publish books. That's interesting. I learned a lot about self-publishing, but that was the first one, was a prayer book. And I often point people to, like, go to that book after you read Slaying Dragons, because this tells you how to have a deep spiritual life. It's very simple. And that's why I love St. Alphonsus. He takes such sublime, powerful, supernatural truths about prayer, how God looks at us, and boils it down to something digestible and practical.
Now, the book Swords and Shadows, Navigating Youth Amidst the Wiles of Satan, what brought that on?
Yeah, that's actually technically the second book. The one that really got me doing what I'm doing now was my third book. So Swords and Shadows. So the impetus behind Slaying Dragons will come in, but this book was written right in the middle of why I was writing Slaying Dragons. So the youth that I was teaching, the high schoolers, knew that I was doing spiritual warfare work, because I kept sharing things I was learning when I was studying from all these exorcists, their videos and books. I didn't interview any until my most recent books, Exposing the Occult. That's when I did my own interviews. But I was using already existing interviews and books and articles and things. So they knew I was doing this. So some of them were on this Diocesan Youth Council, at the advisory board. So they pitched the idea of having me come in to be like one of the keynote speakers and talk about spiritual warfare at the upcoming Diocesan Youth Conference. So they mentioned it to me, and I had about 5 months to prepare. I'm like, oh, sure, yeah. Again, divine providence, like, this is great. So I was examining my life and how the devil had been messing with me in my youth, and then how I wish I had known, and then what I know now. And I presented that to the youth, like, you need to know this now, so the devil doesn't mess with you like he messed with me. You can avoid all these pitfalls, etc. And then I had all this material, and I looked down like, this is too much for the talk. It's 45 minutes, but I have a book here. This could easily be a book. So I put all the files off to the side, cut everything down to a 45-minute talk as best I could. And then I went back to all the files, and boom, Swords and Shadows was born. And that, I can't remember when I published that, a couple months before Slaying Dragons, I believe. And that's been very well received, and now have an endorsement by Monsignor Rossetti, the prominent exorcist in D.C. I have a new cover for that too, a hardcover as well. I'm going to work on the audiobook soon. But parishes, confirmation groups have bought it and given it to the kids. I recommend that for like age 14 and up. I don't go too dark because I want it to be approachable. Some kids really need a book that handles tougher things, but didn't want to go into it. And I don't like to scar the imaginations of my audience. But that was how Swords and Shadows was born.
Now, if it's not too personal, what was the biggest revelation for you about the influence of spiritual warfare when you were younger that kept you from pursuing your faith?
That's a good question. I don't think I've ever thought about that. I think, so in my youth, I suffered from being an outcast, being bullied. And I think maybe this is the answer. And I think this is in Swords and Shadows, is that I let the world, all of those experiences, without Christ having any input, I let the world determine who I was and what my life was going to be. And it was that's why it was very depressing. I remember one point in this kind of mindset, I was talking to my dad, I think it was, about careers, the whole idea of careers. And then he or someone just, printed out a list of popular careers. And I looked at the list and like, this is life? Like, I don't want any of this. Like, then there was nothing, no adventure. Christ gives us an offer of adventure, not just in religious life and priesthood, even in married life and working life. Like, you can do any job, and if you're a devout Christian, that life, that job has a supernatural meaning to it. Plus, on top of that, he offers the religious life and the priesthood, which is an even greater adventure. But when I was a kid, my life was defined by the fallen world, the fallen flesh, and all these mean people that I knew. And the devil was just right there, just like applauding the whole shenanigan, the whole parade, the whole circus that was just crushing me. So that, I think, may be the answer. And I didn't know this was all happening. I didn't know this was the devil's
Right.
manipulation of everything. And it was destroying me. It almost literally killed me. And that's what a lot of youth are up against now.
I think one of the things that has always been so appealing about the Lord of the Rings series is that understanding of the quest, that what you were just talking about, that ultimately our faith puts us on a quest in
Mhm.
everything that we do. And it provides meaning to our life outside of ourselves. I didn't decide this on this quest. That quest has been given to me.
Right.
And I think, that's a wonderful point you were making, is that growing up, you didn't realize that was there. The world was just telling you all this was meaningless.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, because then when the hardship comes, it has meaning. So after my conversion, like all the depression, anxiety, it didn't go away magically. Like it really took 9 years to resolve relatively completely. But that then it had meaning. It was a cross. And like I can't remember, I can't quote it properly, but in Lord of the Rings, when Frodo complains to Gandalf, like, "I wish the ring had never come to me," and the Gandalf's like, "Well, you know." Basically, it's like, take up your cross. Like, this is
Mhm.
what has been given
Yes.
to you. You have a mission, you have a purpose. And we can't control what that's going to be. We can't control what era in the church's life that we are born into. But where you are is what God's going to equip you. He's calling you, and this is it. So embrace it. Embrace your cross, and there's spiritual fruit to be born from it. There's sanctification, merit in heaven. There's all this great, glorious things that God wants to give you if you just join Him in this mission.
That, and of course, we're never guaranteed what the outcome's going to be, and we're told that isn't important at the moment. At the moment, put one foot in front of the other and continue on the quest.
Right, with martyrdom being a great example because there may be like, okay, your life is over. It's a glorious ending. You don't know
Yes.
what's going to come next in the world, but you did it. Okay, here we go. You're a martyr
Yes.
now. But you didn't complete any earthly mission necessarily.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about Slaying Dragons, which is probably your most impactful book. Uh, Tell us a little about it.
Yeah, so the basic structure of the book, we can talk about the origin and everything as well. The basic structure, it's a compilation of the teachings of modern exorcists, and I guess I say in the context of the teachings of doctors of the church, sacred scripture, papal statements about the spiritual war that we're all involved in with proper clarity. So, like the first chapter is really big, and I didn't really, I wasn't a master artist, master author, craftsman at the time, but I like the way it was put together. Chapter one ends up being this really big, really important chapter that lays out the story for the whole book. So, what demons are and what demons aren't, the powers they have, the powers they don't have, how we should be afraid of them, and how we should never be afraid of them. Like all these concepts, all this clarity. What are angels? What's the fall? But then also, what are exorcists? How did they get into this? What can they do? What does the rite of exorcism do? What are the different ways that demons mess with us? Basically, the ordinary temptation we all suffer from and have to endure, and also the more extraordinary things that are rare but sometimes manifest in people's lives depending on what's going on. And then the power of the sacraments, the power of sacramentals, all these blessings that are relatively unknown. This is one of the things that the exorcists I see they are doing is uncovering the great riches of the tradition that have unfortunately been buried since like the 60s. Like the Roman ritual, all these traditional blessings have been around for thousands of years. Even just the power of the sacraments, if you compare the modern baptism rite and the traditional baptism rite, which a lot of exorcists favor, priests favor, there's so much richness there. The doctors of the church, most of us don't know a lot of these old things. They're now labeled as old and we don't know about them, but the exorcists are using them. They're using blessed salt, holy water, blessed crucifixes. And you're like, well, what's the blessing? What's the blessed mean? And there's this rich blessing placed on all these things. And that's what we have sacramentals, which help the flow of grace coming from the sacraments. They're an aid to further the application of sanctifying grace, which comes from the sacraments, into our lives to make us holy. Then there's the question in the book about holiness. The power of holiness repels the devil. So we learn all these tools through the book of based on what exorcists see happening in the rite of exorcism. how we can use it to protect ourselves, push the devil away, but also grow in holiness at the same time, and therefore become an enemy of the devil, rather than seeing the devil as like something coming against us. Like, we're coming against the devil. The church is coming against the kingdom of Satan, and we're part of the church. So then we have this great battle. This is back to the whole, like, what's the mission? What's this adventure, this quest that we're on? It's a spiritual battle that we don't have to be afraid of, which is an interesting twist. So, and then a lot of statistics too about how prominent, how much is the rise of the occult, which was the gateway, kind of the step towards my next book, which was called The Rise of the Occult. So, talk a little bit about the occult, how urgent the need for education on all this stuff is, based on what exorcists are saying. So that's a quick overview of what's in the book.
Now, one thing that came to mind while you were talking, part of the mystery about exorcism, I think, in part is because, especially in the 60s, 70s, 80s of the catechesis in the church, we were actually downplaying even the miraculous in Scripture. There were seminaries teaching that, most of the stories of Jesus that involved miracles were just symbolic and things like this. And of course, if you do that, by default, you're also downplaying the spiritual warfare side of things, because that's just not miraculous. There's nothing there supernatural. And so I think it's important. The work you're doing is reminding us that this is real.
Yeah, real, and also something we don't have to fear. And that was one of there were several aha moments. And I think this will be in my talk when I come down to visit you all, is the aha moments. One of them was, up until studying the teachings of exorcists, I was afraid of demons. And I thought, we're supposed to be afraid of demons. They're demons. Who wouldn't be afraid of them? But that's superstitious almost, because they're not so powerful that we should fear them. Because by fearing them, was that?
I was just going to say, that's one of the other lies, is the fact that the devil and God are on equal footing.
Yeah, and there's some image where I see Christ and Satan like arm wrestling or something. Like, no. There's nothing fair about that fight.
Yes. I've always liked C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters.
Yeah.
Because in part, that's one of the things it tells us, is how easily we are manipulated without force. And I think this is, something worth noting, that, as long as we trust in Jesus, there's really very little we need to fear from other than ourselves and our weaknesses.
Yeah, very much so. And the more I got into this work, the more exorcists I talked to, and that brings up the whole issue of curses, which is something exorcists run into. But other exorcists, like, the closer you come to Christ, like, you don't really need to worry about curses. Like, even if a witch is throwing one at you, like, it's not going to do anything. It's going to not even come near you, bounce off of you, or just dissolve on its way, because the devil's afraid of you. If you are, that's where some of the spiritual work, which is in slaying dragons, the more we pray, fast, do good deeds, all that stuff fortifies us in sanctifying grace. It makes us a terror. Think about the great saints. I mean, the devil was petrified around them. Sometimes he would lash out and attack them, but they didn't care, because they knew, like, all right, that's good, that's fine. You attacked Christ. But yeah, so that confidence is something that we all need. So there's a certain way you have to understand spiritual warfare so that you don't become scared. That's one of the things I've tried to emphasize in my books and in my talks. It's like, be at peace. Like, this should boost your confidence level.
Now, we're getting close to the end of the interview. So what was your biggest aha moment during the research for especially Slaying Dragons and your last book?
Yeah, I would say there were four. I'm trying to remember what the fourth one was right now, but one was the role of the father in a family. Like, oh, that's neat. Like, he has a certain spiritual authority. Pope Pius one of them, Pope the Ninth, I think. I can't remember. I like them all. He said that the father in the family has kind of an episcopal authority in the family. I'm like, wow, that's a powerful statement. So that was one. That wasn't the biggest one, but the rivaling of the two biggest aha moments was, we don't have to be afraid of the devil. because I was, and I thought everybody should be. I'm like, wow, this is huge. This is revolutionary that I don't need to be afraid of the devil, and I shouldn't be at all. But the other one, which is almost equal to that, is the power of sacramentals. I knew I had a master's in theology. One of the ways I describe it is I didn't know half of what these exorcists were teaching. Like, what good is my master's? Like, why don't I know this stuff? Well, I knew a ton, but like I'd heard of holy water. That was about it. Blessed candles. Oh, that's neat. Blessed oil and blessed salt. And oh, you could eat blessed salt and the blessing on crucifixes and on icons. Like what? And scapulars and all this other stuff. Like this is great. And I just latched onto it after doing the research, and it changed my spiritual life. That's one of the things I put in my talks when I visit parishes is the power of these sacramentals to change your spiritual life. There's real power because the devil does not like those either. And it pushes him away and brings special graces for you to walk more confidently in holiness.
Now, you're going to be here in Bryan on Sunday, March 2nd, and you're talking at St. Anthony's Catholic Church at 6:30 p.m. The topic's going to be the wisdom of exorcists in our battle against evil. And I take it that's going to encompass some of the things we've been talking about as far as spiritual warfare and whether or not we should be afraid of the devil.
Yeah, very much. Like pretty much a lot of what we've been talking about today will be in the talk, of course, much more, and elaborating on all these details and giving some more stories that I haven't even shared on this one from my own experience writing the book, the impact of it on my life.
And the second talk will be on Monday, March 3rd, also at 6:30 p.m. at St. Anthony's in Bryan. And the topic of that is the rise of the occult, the dangers and power of grace to defeat it. And I like the title, The Rise of the Occult. Is it more noticeable now, that more evident that the occult is out there actively messing with the world?
Yeah, unfortunately, and I spend a good amount of time. There are two books, The Rise of the Occult and then The Occult Among Us, and they both have a good deal of statistics. And you get even just exorcists talking about their own statistics. Like, this is definitely becoming a problem. And COVID, the isolation, internet addiction during COVID just really exploded this problem. And the statistics of who is in these Wiccan and witchcraft, and we don't have a lot of statistics for Satanists. They don't share very much, but there are some. So, and if you just look at the culture, the cultural trends, like it's bad. So there's a responsibility on modern Catholics to help stop it, but also help people who from our own families who have gone into it. And unfortunately, this is happening to a lot of people. A lot of parishes, families are dealing with it, but a lot of people also converting, leaving the occult, entering the church. The Catholic Church is very attractive right now to people leaving the occult. And there's a reason why, and I'll talk about that too.
Very good. Now, we only have about 3.5 minutes left, so I would like you to give an invite to people to come hear you talk.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. So yeah, so anybody in the area when I'm there, March 2nd and 3rd. Correct me if I get the dates wrong. March 2nd and 3rd. This is a great talk. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions at the end, time permitting, in the structure. I'll have my books there. Happy to sign books. I'll be bringing a sample of pretty much everything. But reading the book has been enlightening for a lot of people if you look at the Amazon reviews. But also whenever you get to hear someone present the material, there are all these new insights. That's one of the things I like about giving the talks. There are all these new insights, and I'm always learning something more. So my talks are always just a little different. But people have all come up to me after all the talks. Like, this is so helpful, so enlightening. They have family members who are struggling. They've been struggling. And the church has real answers. And there's an incarnational principle that we always rely on in the church. So that's why preaching is best, in my experience and other people's experience, is best in person. When you get to hear it all, like all the smells and bells, the person's right in front of you. And I'd be happy to help with any questions at the end too. Though I'm not a priest, not an exorcist, so my abilities are limited, my experience is limited and all that. But I think it'd be very enlightening.
I certainly want to invite everyone, especially here in the Bryan College Station area, to put this on your calendar, March 2nd, 6:30 p.m., and March 3rd, 6:30 p.m. at St. Anthony's Catholic Church in Bryan on 29th and South Parker. One thing you were talking about is the when you're giving your talks in person is the idea that you gain new insights just by giving the talk to different people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is what makes it so wonderful to have the opportunity to have an author come and talk to the congregation about their books, because it sort of fleshes out what you're listening to. And so I am so happy that you're going to be coming down here. I'm so happy that you joined us here on the Roundup. And is there a new book in the works?
There are many books. Time permitting, I'm now at the point with Slaying Dragons Press is what my apostolate has kind of produced, my little publishing company. I'm about to publish several books from other authors, including a popular priest that people will recognize the name of, but we're not yet to the stage where I can mention it. I also have a book coming out through Sophia on a similar topic, Sophia Press. So I'm kind of like, since I'm such a small publishing company, my marketing is awful. So they have good marketing. But yeah, lots of new books coming out: Sacramentals, Spiritual Warfare, Prayer, St. Alphonsus, and more expanding by God's permission, hopefully.
Well, thank you for being on the show. Look forward to seeing you in person March 2nd and March 3rd. I want to remind everyone that we're going to be back for part 2 of the Roundup just after these short breaks and words from our sponsors. So we'll see you on the other side.